There is a moment in every war when the map quietly changes shape and almost no one notices until it is already too late. That moment arrived over Moscow in the dark, when hundreds of small engines crossed an airspace the Kremlin had sworn was the most protected on Earth. What burned that night was an oil refinery. What actually broke was an idea. For years, the Russian capital lived inside a comforting story. The front was somewhere else. The war was something you watched on television, far from the apartment blocks, the glass towers, and the oligarchs' mansions. Moscow was the one place the violence could never reach. That story is now finished. And the strange thing is, the refinery fire is the smallest part of why. Because the visible event, an attack on a fuel facility, is not the real event. The real event is a demonstration. A proof, delivered in flame, that the rules everyone assumed were permanent had already stopped applying. The people on the ground were watching explosions. The people who understand power were watching the future arrive. Ukraine launched the largest, most coordinated long-range aerial strike on Russian soil since the war began. Hundreds of kamikaze drones lifted off at nearly the same moment, aimed at the heart of the country. Across Russia, the total exceeded 550 aircraft. Of those, somewhere between 194 and 200 were directed at Moscow's airspace alone. The capital's lifelines took the hit. Energy infrastructure and logistics nodes were rocked by successive blasts. Strategic points just 15 kilometers from the Kremlin were struck directly. All four of Moscow's major international airports suspended operations. Hundreds of commercial flights were left circling or diverted. The sky above the capital turned into a frozen traffic jam. And then came the detail that tells you everything about how seriously the Kremlin understood the moment. At the height of the chaos, Vladimir Putin was not in Moscow. He was in Kazan, thousands of kilometers away, walking through crowds, smiling for cameras, performing normalcy. The message was deliberate. Everything is under control. But the staging gave away the panic underneath it. While the president shook hands in a distant city, the seat of his power was wrapped in the largest clouds of fire it had ever seen. You do not perform calm unless you are afraid of what the absence of calm would reveal. The easy reading is revenge. Ukraine was struck, so Ukraine struck back. That reading is wrong, and Volodymyr Zelensky said so directly. He framed the operation not as payback, but as the opening of a new strategic era. That is a far larger claim than it first appears. A retaliation ends. A strategic era begins. One closes a chapter, the other rewrites the book. And to understand why Zelensky's framing is accurate rather than rhetorical, you have to look at what was chosen as the target, because the choice itself was the message. The primary objective was the Kapotnya oil refinery in southeastern Moscow. Not a symbolic building, not a propaganda backdrop. A machine that single-handedly supplies roughly 40% of the Moscow region's gasoline and half of its diesel. But even that understates it. Operated by Gazprom Neft, the facility's fractional distillation towers run on high-tech valves and processors that Russia cannot manufacture domestically. Western sanctions have blocked their import entirely. So when Ukrainian planners aimed at those specific towers, they were not blowing up a fuel depot. They were severing a technological nervous system that cannot simply be rebuilt. Replacement parts do not exist inside Russia, and they cannot be bought from outside it. A repair that should take weeks now stretches into months, possibly years. Here is where the scale begins to climb. A damaged refinery is a local problem, but fuel is what moves armies. Diesel is what powers the locomotives that haul ammunition, rations, and reinforcements to tens of thousands of Russian soldiers deep inside Ukraine. Russian military doctrine is welded to its rail network, and that network runs on the very fuel this facility produces. So a single strike, 500 kilometers behind the line, does more to paralyze the front than thousands of artillery shells fired at it directly. The target was not chosen to hurt. It was chosen to disable. And that raises the question that turns the whole story darker. How did hundreds of drones cross deep into Russian territory without being stopped? Ukrainian military intelligence and its newly established unmanned systems forces used a literal swarm. The leading instrument is believed to be the indigenous Firepoint FP-1, a fixed-wing drone known for jet-like speed. Alongside it flew the RS-1 Bars, a jet-powered long-range UAV, and the Bars SM Gladiator, built to carry a heavy warhead. Their decisive feature is independence from infrastructure. Rocket-assisted launch means they need no runway. They can lift off from almost anywhere. That single design choice erases the time and geography that defenders rely on to see an attack coming. But capability is not the same as penetration. The harder mystery is the route. Radar analysts believe the drones launched from the Sumy and Chernihiv regions and threaded straight through Bryansk Oblast. They flew extremely low, skimming the treetops, using terrain masking and rough topography to hide inside the landscape itself. That low-altitude profile slips beneath the blind spots of Russia's large long-range radar systems, which were never built to catch something flying at the height of a forest canopy. Then comes the layer beneath the layer. Using satellite data, Ukrainian intelligence mapped the radar gaps inside Russian airspace into three-dimensional models. Those maps were loaded directly into the drone's autopilots, letting each aircraft alter course the instant it sensed a radar wave. The swarm did not just avoid detection by luck, it navigated by an internal map of where Russia could not see. And around the main strike, a screen of deception. Smaller attacks launched the same night in Rostov, and occupied territories pulled Russian command and control attention in multiple directions, the classic distract and divide. Vanguard decoy drones flew ahead of the swarm, drawing fire from known electronic warfare positions and radar stations, so the lethal aircraft behind them could pass. So the picture grows again. This was not a raid. It was a system defeating a system. Which forces the most uncomfortable question of all. Why did the most heavily defended sky on the planet do nothing? In the weeks before the strike, the Kremlin was telling its people and the world that Moscow possessed the safest, most impenetrable airspace anywhere. And there was visible evidence of effort. Russia's My-26 helicopters, the heaviest transport helicopters on Earth, were filmed over the city carrying classified cargo. That cargo was air defense. Pantsir SMD-E short-range systems being lowered onto the rooftops of skyscrapers and strategic buildings. One was placed atop the Nord Star Tower, a 42-story civilian building, an urban missile fortress assembled in plain sight. But that engineering effort was not a show of strength. Read correctly, it was a confession of weakness. Mounting a Pantsir on the roof of a civilian high-rise is reckless. The vibrations and wind shear threaten the structural integrity of the building beneath it. No general staff accepts that risk casually. They accept it only when the alternative is worse. By lifting these systems onto rooftops, the Russian command was admitting, without words, that its ground-level radar had already been blinded by low-altitude flight. The roofs were an attempt to climb above the city's own concrete shadows and artificially raise the radar horizon. The desperation was built into the architecture. On paper, Moscow's defense is the densest layered air shield in the world. The outer ring, S-300 and S-400 batteries with ranges of hundreds of kilometers, built to hunt ballistic missiles. The middle ring, Pantsir systems, each carrying up to 48 short-range missiles, with a combined salvo capacity estimated at more than 700 missiles fired at once. A multi-billion-dollar fortress. And it collapsed against a simple equation. This doctrine was inherited from the Soviet era. It was designed to stop NATO's strategic bombers and intercontinental missiles, fast, large, expensive targets arriving in predictable numbers. What arrived instead were hundreds of slow objects moving at 200 kilometers per hour, sounding like moped engines, made of fiberglass, with almost no radar signature. The systems could not even agree on what they were looking at. Vast algorithms locked up when confronted with a handful of plastic parts. When the swarm appeared all at once, packed with cheap decoys, the defenses reached total saturation. As each battery locked onto the targets in front and emptied its launchers, the sky behind it fell undefended, and the real strike drones glided through the gap while the batteries reloaded. And then the economics, which is where the strategic meaning truly lives. A single S-400 missile costs millions. The decoy drones Ukraine sent up, some made of wood and plastic, cost a few thousand. Russia is being forced to destroy $100,000 targets with million-dollar weapons, and there is no way to win that trade. Every interception makes the defender poorer and the attacker barely poorer at all. A pantsir can only track so many targets at once. Push 80 contacts into its radar in the same second and its processing capacity overflows. It goes blind. Ukraine attacked both the software ceiling and the wallet simultaneously. The shield did not fail because it was weak. It failed because it was expensive, and expense is exactly what a swarm is designed to bankrupt. This is the moment the object becomes a symbol. The refinery stops being a refinery. It becomes the proof that an entire category of national defense, the kind built around a few exquisite, costly weapons, has been rendered obsolete by the cheap and the many. The first consequence is fuel. Knocking Kapotnya offline does not just leave civilians without gasoline. It strangles the supply-feeding military convoys and rail logistics. The diesel that moves Russian reinforcements forward is the same diesel this facility refines. The second consequence is national. Russia's gasoline production has reportedly fallen to a 16-year low. The state has begun imposing fuel quotas at filling stations and demanding cash-only payment. Refined oil exports, one of the country's largest revenue streams, are being cut at the source, ripping a hole in the budget that finances the war itself. Without oil sales, it becomes mathematically harder by the day to fund munitions and pay soldiers. The third consequence is psychological, and it may matter most. Picture a Russian infantryman in a frontline trench, short on ammunition, told he is fighting to protect the homeland. Then he sees that the homeland's safest point, the capital, is on fire. The chain of command he risks his life for has just demonstrated in front of the entire world that it cannot protect its own center. Faith does not survive that image intact. Now picture the Russian public, told for years that the war would never reach their windows, watching black smoke rise outside those very windows. And picture the elite, the oligarchs who treated the war as television, now hearing air defense missiles detonate near their mansions and commercial towers. The bill for the war has been delivered to their doorstep. This is where a military event becomes a political one. The fault lines behind the closed doors of the Kremlin can be widened by exactly this kind of shock. The quiet, dangerous question of whether the people in charge can actually keep the country safe. A new actor has just entered the story, Russia's own population. And once that actor is awake, no air defense system can be deployed against it. Analysts are already naming it World War I with drones. In 1914, machine guns and artillery froze armies into trenches and turned the front into a static hell. Today, autonomous systems threaten to freeze the front line all over again. But Ukraine broke the deadlock by refusing to play on the front line at all. Instead of trying to pierce the trenches, it moved the war's center of gravity hundreds of kilometers to the rear, into the factories, the refineries, the logistics that keep an army alive. And the strategic feedback loop is brutal. To defend Moscow, Russia must pull Panzer batteries and air defense systems away from the front and back to the capital. That thins the protective umbrella over its own troops, opening Russian mechanized units to Ukrainian FPV drones and long-range fire. Defending the heart weakens the limbs. There is no clean way out of that bind. The strike also resets the calculations far beyond Russia's borders. By proving it can hit Russia's deepest targets with its own weapons, Ukraine is dismantling the West's long-standing fear of escalation, one taboo at a time. The pessimism that had settled over Western capitals is giving way to something Ukraine has not enjoyed in some time: renewed belief in the possibility of victory. That belief changes the diplomatic table. Zelensky has argued that economic and psychological blows of this scale make realistic negotiations more likely than ever, precisely because no amount of tactical territory gained at the front can fill the strategic void created by destruction in the heart of Moscow. He is also making an argument to his allies. Invest not only in defensive weapons, but in offensive capability of the kind that can actually end the war. Strip everything else away, and the lesson is stark. No capital can any longer claim to be safe from unmanned technology, no matter how many hundreds of kilometers separate it from the front. The fortress model of national defense, a ring of brilliant, costly interceptors around a precious center, has met something it was never designed to survive. The refinery that burned was never just a refinery. It was the moment the 21st century told the 20th that its assumptions had expired. Old assumption: distance equals safety. Emerging reality: distance is irrelevant when the attacker is cheap, patient, and many. The new rule of warfare is being written in the smoke over Moscow, and every government on earth is reading it. The Kremlin is now trapped between two things it cannot reconcile: military pride and economic reality. Repairing the refineries under sanctions could take years. The revenue financing the war is draining. And the story it told its people, that they were untouchable, has been disproven on live television. The fires over Moscow have settled, but the consequences have barely begun to move. The coming weeks will show how these asymmetric strikes echo through the budget, the front line, and the diplomatic table. So the real questions are the ones nobody can yet answer. If Ukraine can breach the most defended airspace in the world this easily, does that crack the Russian public's faith in the regime itself? Under this combined logistical and financial pressure, how much longer can Russia sustain a war while its economic arteries are being cut one by one? And the largest question of all, when distance no longer means safety, has the balance of power already shifted before the world has even agreed that it changed? Tell us what you think in the comments. We'd genuinely like to hear where you think this goes next. And if you want to take this with you, you'll find our content on Spotify too. Thank you for choosing us. Brought to you by TGN.